Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Trey Johnson, and thank you for joining us for Museum After Hours. This evening, we're glad to have Dr. Eric P. Anderson back on our program. Dr. Anderson received his doctorate in American history from the University of Kansas, specializing in American Indian cultures and the history of the United States West. He's an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and teaches at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence. His major research focus is on American Indian education, especially the system of federal boarding schools established for Native youth in the late 19th century. He's currently working on projects about the history of Haskell Institute, as well as a textbook examining American Indian cultures and history. When we last had him on, Dr. Anderson focused on the roots of federal policies that created the system of boarding schools and how Native cultures persisted despite the harsh experiences students faced. Tonight's presentation, Diversity and Complexity in Indian Kansas, will examine Native groups who inhabited Kansas by the early 19th century, as well as emigrant tribes and other American Indians who arrived later, emphasizing changes over time. We'll have some time after the presentation to answer questions, so feel free to use the chat or Q&A feature, and we will get to as many as we can after the presentation's over. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Eric P. Anderson.
Thank you, Trey. I appreciate that. Nice introduction and your assistance, as always, with the technology. Now, let me see if I can get it to work. Okay. Also, thanks to Joy Brennan for facilitating tonight's talk and Kansas State Historical Society as the hosting institution. And it looks like we have a good number of people here on the remote presentation. So that's great. I appreciate you as well spending some time in this presentation and discussion. So I'm going to launch into things, and I will probably keep my remarks to 30-ish minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So let's see. Are we able to see my screen?
It looks perfect. I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thanks again so much. So welcome everyone. Tonight's talk, as you heard and saw on the introductory film there, is entitled Diversity and Complexity in Indian Kansas, and I wanted to talk just a moment about that title. Historians, I think, are often proud of their titles and maybe think they bear more explanation than they might, but bear with me. So diversity is important because I think there still is a persisting mentality that Native American people are much the same, that they all lived in teepees and they all hunted buffaloes and very much are in keeping with the kind of stereotype of Indians that we have seen in film for much of film's history. But the truth, in fact, is that there's a great range of different tribal distinctions, traditions, cultures, languages, spiritual beliefs. And Kansas is really representative of that diversity, both in the earlier time period that I'm going to look at initially, and then as time moves on and different groups come into this place that we now call Kansas. So that's the diversity part. Complexity. This is another one. I think that there's long been a standing bias in our American society, and it probably predates that, going back to colonial times, that Native cultures are inherently simple, particularly in comparison to Western ones. And a big part of the relationship between Native people and non-Native people or newcomers, or whatever you'd like to call them, is predicated on that prejudice that Native cultures needed to be changed, needed to be modernized, needed to be civilized. And I would argue that there is an incredible amount of complexity, not simplicity, in these cultures. They have their own ways of doing things, their own systems of child rearing and education, of ceremony and ritual and warfare and legal standards and every other type of pillar that we might think of that makes a society complex is inherently part and parcel of Native peoples. So we will focus on Kansas as is fitting, and there's a map, kind of just a sample map looking at Kansas. And I showed this first not only to orient us to the topic, but because Kansas, in many ways, not just with relationship to Native people, but in broader ways as well, has always been a crossroads. And I think that's really true for Indian Kansas as well. It's been a place where dozens of tribal nations have resided, have passed through, and in many cases remain. So that's my little spiel about the title of tonight's talk. And um, there we go. I will now go to another map. And this is kind of an imagining. As you can see, it says early Indian tribes in Kansas. It's not perfect, but this is an approximation of the major groups that new people arriving in the West uh, would have encountered in terms of Indian peoples who were settled in this part of the country, certainly by the very early 19th century, and even going back a bit further. There are groups that are not included here, much earlier groups, Caddoan speaking peoples, Siouan speaking peoples, who encountered folks like the Spanish and the French well before Kansas became a state or the United States even existed as a concept and a nation. There are certain groups that probably kind of cover this timeline as well, who are not on the map. When we think of the Wichita people, for instance, or the Oto, Missouri. Um, of course, the borders that we define as Kansas today, are a function of United States policy. So they're imaginary in terms of the native people who passed through and who settled here. But these are kind of the predominant groups that I'd like to focus on for the purposes of this talk. So kind of starting at the middle top, north central area, the Pawnee people, who are also very closely associated with areas in Nebraska. To the right, in kind of the northeast quadrant, the Kansa people, or Kaw, as they're recognized by the United States government today, or Kansi, as they called themselves. The Osage, who have been much in the spotlight lately due to the success of the film Killers of the Flower Moon. The Osage also inhabited a large part of what we think of as Kansas today, as well as a number of other places. And then moving over to the left-hand side in the southwest, the Kiowas and Comanches, and moving further up into the middle western portion of the area and the northwestern, the Arapaho and the Cheyenne. Again, it's not a perfect map, but I think it's a pretty good representation of a number of the well-established tribes that new folks would have encountered by the time more and more of them began to arrive, certainly by the 1820s or 30s. So those are the ones I like to predominantly focus on, and then I want to look at the changes that occurred. So I'll kind of go through these groups one by one and give you a little bit of information on them. It's really a thumbnail sketch. All of them, you know, easily deserve their own PowerPoint, their own presentation. But I want to look at this place we think of as Kansas on the whole. And so these groups, I think, make a good representative cross section. And again, think about those terms that I pointed to at the beginning in the introductory slide, diversity and complexity. So for the Kansas people, it seems perhaps logical to start there because it is the Kansas, after all, who give their name to the state that we think of today as Kansas. And these would have been folks located in the area west of Topeka. They therefore have this connection to the local history where the State Historical Society is housed. They were then moved to the area around present-day Council Grove, and their name means people of the South Wind in translation from their own language. And what you see there in terms of that graphic is the seal of the Kaw or Kansas nation as a European or Euro-American conventions began to seep into native life more and more. Tribes began to do things like adopt flags and seals and things like that that are more associated with the Western way of thinking than native. But you have this connection there on the seal to the land of Kansas and the horses the Europeans brought. Um, I should say, because we're going to look at a map here in a little while that shows a great deal of change, that even before new folks were coming out to this area that we call Kansas today, there were rippling effects of what was happening further to the east. So, we could go way back. We don't have time to do that. But, if you are a student of colonial history, if you thought about something like the French and Indian War that was taking place for the most part in the northeast of what's now the United States and into Canada as well, in the 1760s, and there was in fact a global conflict called the 7 Years' War back over in Europe. There's an impact that will affect how Kansas begins to change and to come into focus as we think about it, even before statehood, but certainly by the time statehood arrives. The American Revolution, which follows on the heels of the French and Indian War, also has its effect because it opens up settlements into the West that had been forbidden under the terms of peace in the French and Indian War. So I think it's useful to consider, kind of how we get to where we are. And as an historian, you always keep looking back to the past. The Kansas people were very much impacted as new people come in, and that pared down their land base and opened up settlement for those new folks, and gradually whittled away their presence in the area. And that's true of a lot of the people who are referenced on that map I just showed you. And so this slide shows a few different kinds of images related to the Kansas or Kaw people. As you can see at the top, there's a couple of different photographs of delegations, diplomatic envoys being sent to Washington to lobby on behalf of the Kansas people as they endured challenges and struggles to hold on to their land. And you can see by some of the dress, particularly in the one that's, I think it would be on your left top. To me, maybe the orientation looks different, so forgive me if it does. But you can see that the clothing styles incorporate both native and Western modes of dress, and that there are medallions that some of these gentlemen are wearing that are peace medals, essentially, that were given out by various presidents of the United States to these visiting delegations. And in the other picture, they appear, for the most part, in more traditional clothing and regalia. I also included on here a couple of pictures of the commission. I noticed in the little film introduction that there was a a screen in there that said the Caw Mission and Last Chance store in Council Grove are now open. They've undergone, there are a lot of historic sites in Council Grove, but the mission in particular has undergone a lot of changes, particularly to the way the story of the Kaw people is presented, to offer it a more native perspective, or at least the perspective of the people who were being missionized by this one exemplar of denominational proselytizing that was taking place in a number of areas throughout the state. And this is just one example. So, as Indians and non-Indians or new people increasingly came into each other's orbits, there are things going on like trade. There are treaties being made for land cessions. But one of the earliest examples of interaction would be the mission system. And in fact, its origins include some of the earliest non-native people to come to the state. And the Kaw mission makes a great example for that. There are other missions that emerged, like the Ottawa mission to the Ottawa people around present-day Ottawa, Kansas. The Methodist mission at what's now Fairway, the so-called Shawnee mission. That's been in the news a lot lately in terms of whether land is going to be ceded back to the Shawnee people. And there are a number of others. Most of them in Kansas tended to be Protestant denominations, with some exceptions. So the Potawatomis, for instance, experienced missionizing efforts by the Roman Catholic Church and its priests. And while there are differences in terms of kind of those denominational aspects, there's a real similarity as well. And I wanted to include, at least this one example of a mission among the several that came into existence, because I think they reflect, again, that idea that Indians were heathenish, were simple, were savage, and in need of salvation. And so the Christian missionizing efforts, I think, took that as a starting point. When we look at the long history of relationships between natives and newcomers, there is very much that strain of trying to change Indian people, to bend them, certainly culturally, if not behaviorally, to Western standards of doing things. So they're predicated on this assumption of simplicity or backwardsness, primitive state that needed to be changed or remade. I'll turn now to the Osage people. And as you can see by these maps, historians love maps, obviously, right? Throwing maps at you. The Osage, the Washawi people occupied a huge mass of land. You have a very good indication of that in the map that's on the left-hand side. And again, you see a seal of the Osage Nation. So again, in a time before the borders of what's now the modern United States existed, the Osage have this huge reach across the Middle Plains into the kind of Middle South, as it's called today, and even further east. So Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, those states as they exist today would have been the heart of Osage country. And it's a pretty impressive amount of land that they occupied and held. Some historians have referred to nations like the Osage and the Comanches, and we'll talk about a little bit in a moment, as imperial Indians. I'm not sure that I love that terminology because it borrows, again, from a kind of non-native notion of empire-driven presence. And while the Osage certainly commanded a large swath of land that we could refer to as an empire, because it did, at some level, extract tribute from smaller tribes, um, but it also did not try to stamp them out or assimilate them, I guess, into Osage culture. And I think that's a key difference that is less true of other empires globally. It was a very complex system of government that the Osage operated, and it makes sense. They would have to in order to um, administrate over this large territory. So there you have a picture, another photograph of Osage men, again with some mixture of both traditional and Western clothing as new standards of dress came into their world. And then a more stylized, but based on life portrait. And I believe that's a George Catlin of an Osage warrior. Thomas Jefferson, among others, marveled at the appearance of the Osage in their regality, in many cases commenting on their the height of the men, that they were among the largest, tallest of the native peoples that Americans would encounter. And so I think this painting, does some service to that kind of stately appearance that Western commentators were making as the Osage began to appear more regularly in the path of expansion. The Pawnees consist of four major bands, and a number of these tribes are situated that way. So they were talking about smaller bands of people, whether they are nomadic, pursuing the big game, primarily the American bison, or as we commonly call it, the buffalo. These smaller groups are easier to sustain. The Pawnees are different than many of these other original, or at least notably present groups by the early part of the 19th century. The difference with the Pawnees is that they were village farmers. They're horticulturalists, so they're growing crops as their primary economic method of sustenance. But they also depended on the buffalo, as did most of the tribes in the area we call Kansas today. Not so true of later arrivals, and that's in part because they came from different environments where there weren't so many buffalo, but also because as they began to arrive, that coincided with the mass slaughter and destruction of the buffalo. So there just weren't nearly as many around. So the Pawnees have this mixed economy, agricultural as well as the hunting economy, centered on the bison. And I included another painting, George Catlin, here again. That last one I showed you might have actually been Carl Bodmer. Memories escape me sometimes. But these bison who kind of look perplexed at these Pawnee hunters who are approaching them, dressed up in wolf's clothing, so to speak. I just really like the ambiance of that painting. And then you have this depiction that shows the immense dependence of plains people, buffalo hunting people on the bison itself. Everything from clothing and housing, and of course to food, but also tools, and adornments, ornaments, and even basic, conveyances. So this gives you some sense of the centrality of the buffalo, to many of the plains groups. But I wanted to, make clear there are others, including the Osage, certainly the Pawnee, who also have these village systems. They're not just constantly moving around following big game. The Pawnees also have a very complex kind of cosmological sense of the universe. They saw themselves as being descendants of the stars, star people, and they arranged their villages in star patterns so that it reflected the night sky, and and that would change with the different viewpoints of the sky, different times in the year. Gives some indication of their star knowledge, their astronomical knowledge, scientific knowledge. So again, goes to that idea of complexity. Because of this kinship with the stars, um, their society was structured hierarchically, because some were seen as descendants of what were considered to be more important stars, more visible stars, the morning star, for instance, and some of lesser stars. So it's a complex social structure that they exhibit as well. And this, the two images here, one is a buffalo skin that is depicting that star knowledge, that they're able to observe the movement of the stars, the placement of the stars. And I think that certainly, flies in the face of that bias that Native people are not complex or did not have the same level of insight or learning that Europeans or Euro Americans did. And then you have their a Pawnee, a representative Pawnee man who's got this very intricate buckskin shirt with a lot of designs on it, probably depicting historical events, astronomical knowledge as well, and then of course the very distinctive hairstyle common among Pawnee men, that we might more closely associate with the Mohawk style, but no, they weren't the only ones to use something similar. With regard to the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes, and I'm going to talk about them together because they're very closely allied with one another. These are people, at least by the time of the probably early 18th century, have essentially changed from a more predominant horticultural economy to a buffalo and horse driven one. So they are closely allied and have some cultural similarity, but I want to be careful to again, with regard to that idea of diversity, point out that they are distinct. The times of competition that existed even before the arrival of Europeans and persisted even after they came, and the Euro-American descendants who followed, was one that was filled with a lot of rivalry and a lot of warfare. And so, for instance, the Cheyennes and Arapahoes were nearly constantly at war with the Pawnees. And part of that is because the Pawnees were fixed villagers, and that means that they had stores of supplies, as well as being situated in at least a semi-permanent kind of place. The Pawnees would move their villages, alternate their locations over different years, but more or less were sedentary, with the exception of those semi-annual buffalo hunts. The both the northern and both the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes have northern and southern divisions. And those would really be emphasized by the middle of the 19th century. Um, so whereas prior to that, there was a lot more, at least yearly or perhaps semi-annual reunions, so to speak. That those divisions got exacerbated by just the development of outside forces, and that would include the arrival of more and more outsiders um, clamoring for land, trying to establish new settlements, and in particular the railroad, which would divide not only the bison herds, but also native peoples, who depended on them. Um, so again, Cheyennes and Arapahoes are moving out into the West from kind of the Minnesota Great Lakes region by the late 17th century, and they come to rely principally upon the horses that were introduced by Europeans. They become very skilled horse people, and having a very special, sacred, even relationship with the horse, as well as with the buffalo. I think that looking generally at all of the groups that are part of this discussion, at least up to the point where things begin to change rather dramatically. There's very much built into this economy a spiritual component, so that buffaloes and horses and other animals and plants are part of a reciprocal exchange that's built on a recognition of sacrifice that benefit um, the lives and persistence of Native people. Um, Cheyennes have certainly been represented in Western literature and historical writing and film, and probably most famously as being allies of the so-called Sioux people, which is a misnomer, a name for a large uh, grouping of distinct peoples, but probably best known for the part that they played as allies, Indian allies against George Custer and the Seventh Cavalry, particularly at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And then, kind of finally, with regard to that original map I showed you, the Kiowas and Comanches, also closely allied but distinct. And while they are, I think, by and large associated with the Southern Plains and to some extent the Southwest, certainly they ranged into Western Kansas, um, even by the early 18th century. And after a long series of migrations throughout the plains and elsewhere. These are another group that some historians have referred to as imperial Indians. And again, I mentioned that that may not be the best word, but it's a term that's kind of stuck. So the Comanches also, I think, have been represented uh, pretty popularly in the dominant culture, in film, in historical writings, and in particular for their skilled horsemanship and their prowess in battle. Um, I wanted to kind of conclude this section, and the next part's shorter, but I wanted to conclude here with the Treaty of Medicine Lodge. This is one of the most important series of agreements, actually, to take place, I would argue, among all of the long history of treaties between Western people and Native ones. And it involves a number of these groups that we were talking about: Kiowas, the Comanches, the Kiowa Apaches, who are a division but separate of the Kiowas and the Cheyennes. These were meant to settle territorial disputes as the state of Kansas, opened itself up to statehood, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and followed not long thereafter by Bleeding Kansas and Civil War, which caused all kinds of upset and refugee status for Native and non-Native people alike. It's also among one of the very last treaties that the United States government would sign with Indians. The treaty period came to an end in 1871. And this one is in some ways emblematic of the problems of the treaty system because it didn't really fully settle the issues at hand. And it really did not redound to the benefit of Native people, as it was pushed aside pretty quickly in favor of policies that would encourage increased populations of non-Native people to enter the area. So in some ways, it signals an end to this older period of Indian Kansas, because when we look at this map in comparison to that one I showed you all the way back here, things look pretty different. When I ask my students to look at this and tell me what do they see, what are some of the major differences? Well, for one, there are very distinct boundaries now, where it looked like many of those early tribes were settled along the rivers and the waterways. Some of that still exists, but they've been delineated with very defined borders. So these reservations are meant to contain Native people, where once their movement was unrestricted. By the time of the middle part of the 19th century, we have very sharply defined right angles that are in keeping with Western ways of thinking about land. Some of them aren't all right angles, but some of them clearly are. That's one difference. Another difference is you see a lot of different Indians here who were not on that other map. That includes some migrating from Missouri, that include, by and large, all manner of immigrant tribes who are new to the area. And that includes folks like the Delawares from all the way originally out in the area of what's now Pennsylvania, Shawnees and Peorias and Kaskaskias who are essentially being pushed out of the Ohio River Valley and are kind of wandering a path of removal. Some of them include folks like the Ottawa or Odawa and Potawatomi, who are Great Lakes people, and the Chippewas. They are confronted with being resettled in a place that to them is very, very unfamiliar, vastly different kind of environment, and they face a lot of challenges in trying to replicate their traditional lifestyle and also in trying to grapple with how they're going to adapt to the new places in which they find themselves. That includes new crops, new plant life, new animals, lack of timber, and of sugar-bearing trees and things like that that would have been important to the traditional economies of a number of these groups. And a third major difference would be you really don't see many at all of those groups from that first map. The Cheyennes and Arapahoes are gone. The Kiowas and Comanches are gone. The Pawnees are gone. You do have an Osage Reserve, obviously dramatically reduced from what it once was, or the lands that they once held. There's a Kaw or Kansas Reserve, and these would be continued to be whittled down. And in fact, almost all of these groups would eventually then be moved on elsewhere. Very few remnants of most of these groups remain, with the exception of the 4 reservations that still exist in Kansas: Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Sac and Fox, and Iowa. And it's worth noting, none of those groups are original inhabitants of this area. They all came from somewhere else. So Kansas is shaping up as that crossroads that I indicated, and it's undergoing an enormous amount of change in the 19th century. And then I wanted to point out, since I teach at Haskell, it's always front and center of my mind. Another part of the story of Indian Kansas is the creation of this federal boarding school at Lawrence in 1884, which starts off small, a couple of dozen students, but really begins to bring in a large population of Native people from across the country. So even by the late 1890s, um, students at this boarding school are being brought in from places as far away as California and Alaska. And it's also beginning to flavor the demographics of Indian Kansas, because you have lots and lots of different people from different places coming into Kansas. And a legacy of that, of course, having been in Lawrence for 140 years, is that Haskell, has engendered a very substantial Native American community. As Trey mentioned, the last time I did a talk with the After Hours program was on the history of Haskell Institute, and I'm not going to revisit it more than just to color that in and say, this is also part of the picture of the changing of Indian Kansas. And I'll just kind of come to an end. I think I've gone past my 30 minutes a little bit with this historical marker, and it's making reference to a number of these different groups that I just talked about. I'm certainly beginning by the 1820s, and then that period of great immigration, kind of refugee Indians in a way I might call them, who then were shuttled off to someplace else, for the most part Oklahoma, which was promised as a permanent Indian frontier, or Indian territory, and we know that that also did not remain the case. And then concluding with the fact that the 4 Indian reservations here, Potawatomi, Kickapoossack, and Fox in Iowa, are all relatively recent arrivals, even though we tend to identify Indian Kansas with their presence. So I will wrap up just with the comment that I think this short little slideshow indicates, at least I hope it does, that Kansas has really been a diverse and complex place, with a long history of Native people, Native settlements, and Native cultures represented here. People who have called this place home over that time, and particularly looking at that short bit of time, relatively speaking, in the 19th century, how much changed. But the economies, the governments, the legal systems, the spiritual beliefs, the artistic expression, among numerous other things, reflect that very intense and vibrant set of cultures and life ways that have been important and I think continue to influence Kansas. So I will leave it there, and I will turn to what questions you have, and we'll try and wrap up maybe in about 15 minutes or so, but I'd love to hear any comments or thoughts you have.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. As we wait for some kind of questions to roll in, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the textbook that you're working on, because that sounds like a fantastic resource for educators, museums, a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, so it's morphed over time, as projects like that do. The original intent, so to speak, was that it would be a group of scholars who, from across different quarters of academia, mostly historians, but not all, would try to put into place a bit of a primer, really, that would provide some counterpoint to, I think, what most of us, so certainly people my age, I think to a certain extent, those who were younger as well, really did not get to experience in our public education about Indians, right? To fill in some of these ideas, like I talked about, diversity and complexity, for instance. Um, As time has gone on, that while that idea is still very much at the core, it's kind of started to take shape almost more as a textbook for the field of American Indian studies. It's going to have a similar flavor, but maybe a slightly different package.
Perfect. Well, you got to keep us posted.
Okay, thank you for that.
Um, we had someone ask if you happen to know what created the split between the Sac and Foxes of Missouri and Mississippi.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of internal divisions. The Kickapoos, for instance, would be another example where you have different pockets of Kickapoo settlement, even into what's today Mexico. Some of those divisions may have been internal. There's a long history of factionalism within Indian cultures, and I would hasten to add that I think that in a lot of cases that's been a good thing because it's allowed for debate and lack of stagnation. And of course, once cultures go stagnant, then they're not going to be around very long. But there are other external pressures that may have acted on those kinds of divisions as well. I am not an expert by any means on the Sac and Fox, so I don't want to misspeak about that one. But to think of the example of Potawatomis, for instance, I mean, there are still a number of major bands located. Some of them still back in the Great Lakes area, some of them across the border into Canada. But just thinking about the Kansas story of the Potawatomis, the group who came and eventually were placed on lands in Kansas were designated as kind of mission Indians because they had a long history of trade and intermarriage and economic connections with the French, and that included at least some adoption, if not outright conversion, to Catholicism. So when the folks who came along the so-called Trail of Death arrived in Kansas, there was some internal division that we eventually brewed over, and there was a split. So that you have the Prairie Potawatomis who remain with the reservation in Kansas, and then my own tribal division, the Citizen Potawatomis, so named because they decided to take citizenship quite early. We're celebrating or commemorating at least 100 years of the blanket policy of citizenship this year, in 1924. So it was 1868 when that group of Potawatomis took citizenship. So it could be internal divisions, it could be external pressures. It's about the best answer I can give.
Oh, thank you. Tying into speaking of the Potawatomi, Jerry here is asking why they were relocated so often.
Good question. Yeah, I think a lot of that is going to be um, a question of policy. So you have, for instance, you saw on that last map I showed you, there's a little tiny so-called Cherokee strip in the southeast portion of the state of Kansas. Um, Cherokees, one major group of the Cherokee Nation is in Oklahoma. There are other divisions in other places, but um, these are people who are originally from the southeast. These are people who experienced, something that I think we've all heard of, the Trail of Tears, forced removal that was happening as a piece of policy. Andrew Jackson's policy of removal. But there are a lot of others who come not as a, um, de jure or, legal mechanism, but more de facto that could include people like the Shawnees and some of the smaller tribes, the New York Indians, for instance, who were here, who are just, essentially trying to cling on to anything because they're being so overwhelmed in terms of population, the loss of land, and the outright hostility that existed in the places where I previously called home. So I think there are those policy pieces that impact how people got here. And then others, like I said, just really are kind of refugees in a way. And the Civil War really ramped that up too, because it displaced so many people, and there were divided loyalties in the Civil War among Native groups, some siding with the Union and others with the Confederacy. So that if you looked at, excuse me, a place like Franklin County, to the south of Lawrence. At one time around the Civil War, there's something like 27 different Indian groups in Franklin County. Didn't last very long, but that's an indication, I think, of how those kinds of disruptions can create these avenues for the movement of people. And then again, as things happen, like the development of the state of Kansas, as it approaches statehood and becomes an actual member of the Union, that was going to have a deep impact on those Indians who'd been there, maybe for 20 or 30 years. And then again, no, it's time for you to go because we're going to move you someplace else because we want this land here for something.
That was a fantastic answer. Very in-depth. Thank you. I'm
You're
sure
welcome.
Jerry greatly appreciates that.
Of
Um,
course.
so I'd like to give a shout out. You have a former student of yours from American Indian Studies 110
Oh,
giving you a thank you for the presentation. Um,
no, great.
it looks like Alicia or Alicia.
Mhm.
So thank you so much for tuning in. We had someone else ask what roughly time period was the your first map, the early Indian tribes of Kansas. I mean, are we
Mhm.
talking pre 1500s?
No, I would say that fairly closely approximates, if we had to put a years on it, like by 1800,
Okay.
maybe um, late 17th or excuse me, late 18th, early 19th centuries. Because as I mentioned, there are older groups who were here well before them who might see folks like the Cheyennes as being recent arrivals, really. But I was trying to paint a picture where that is approximating the Indian groups who were in place by the time the non-native presence began to increase.
Perfect. We got a question from a different platform, outside platform, someone reaching out. How would you suggest elementary grades teach about Native Americans in Kansas? Any techniques, resources, advice for this educator?
Yeah, it's a great question. And although I don't teach students that age, I've certainly have visited with them in their educational environments at grade schools, middle schools. I think there are just so many opportunities where you can, because American Indian history is American history. And so, if you're teaching a section on the Revolutionary War, if you're teaching a section on, Manifest Destiny or something like that, how do we integrate the experience of Native peoples at those different milestones or crossroads or whatever you want to call them? I think there may be a tendency sometime on the a part of educators for a couple of different reasons to engage with that, and one of them may be that those folks don't feel like they have the expertise. Another may be because these they often broach very difficult subjects, right? That could be upsetting, for young people. But I would just say, if those are things that are holding people back, they shouldn't, because you're already doing things that you deem age appropriate for how you teach things, because we got to teach about, I just saw this exhibit at the World War I Museum today called The Little Wars about children's experiences,
Right.
so you're already trying to figure out the best ways to present materials to young people. And I think you can do the same thing with sensitivity here. And don't let, a self-imposed idea about lack of expertise hold you back, because I know that our educators, particularly, K through 12, are asked to wear a huge number of hats and
Yes.
have to be held to standards of education in all of these different areas, which are like, wow, that's more than what I do in the college classroom. So um I would also reference, I really looked at that introductory film clip or whatever you want to call it, that you showed at the beginning. It looked like there were some really good resources there, for um, educators, to how you make certain things, do projects with the class. I saw the braided corn or the beaded corn there. I saw something about native housing types. And so I think the State Historical Society is also really a good resource for that.
Well, thank you very much. Definitely makes us feel good. So looks like we have about time for one more question. And you, in your last response, you said something that was just fantastic. I believe you said, American Indian history is U.S. history,
Mhm.
and I've
Sure.
heard that said very much like Black history. Black history
Oh,
is
yeah,
U.S. history.
absolutely.
So we had Ellen that reached out and said the country has come around to
Mhm.
recognizing the strength and the treatment of the Black community. Do you
Mhm.
feel as a country we'll be able to do the same thing for Native peoples?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've come a long ways. I certainly do. I've seen a lot of change even just in the 15 or so years I've been at Haskell, in terms of the greater awareness and discourse, in the general population. We have a long ways to go yet, but I do think that's encouraging, and historians are not always the most encouraging group of people. So, um, we see changes being very slow and less than dynamic usually. But I do think there's a lot of promise out there for that. I like the idea that we've come around. That's a hopeful way of putting it. I think there are probably there are pockets of resistance to that as well. That we all know of things that are happening and I'm not going to get political, but we know things are happening around the country where, there are things being put into place, for instance, in educational environments that are meant to shield, shelter, protect, whatever you want to call it, wherever you're coming from on it. That sometimes, um, purposefully or not, can limit um, those moments for dynamic change or for coming around. But overall, I'm hopeful.
I'm very glad to hear that. Well, hey, we will not keep you. But thank you again for
Of
taking the
course.
time out of your schedule. This was just a great opportunity, and you still have many thanks rolling in the chat. So we
Appreciate that, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a good night. I hope the weather holds for wherever you happen to be tonight.
Yes, yeah. Everyone stay safe.
Yeah.
And please join us again next month, April 10th, 6:30 p.m. to hear Marion Calabro present the real story of the Donner Party.
Yeah,
So
that looks pretty good.
so
Take
we will
care,